Involvement with the criminal justice system is life-changing. It matters.
Having a justice system that works is a really important part of a democratic society.
I'm Penelope Gibbs, Director of Transform Justice.
I'm Rob Allen. I've worked in and around criminal justice all my career.
This is the Transform Justice podcast, throwing light on the criminal justice system.
Hearing from people who know.
It's about whether the system's fair
and what can be done to make it better.
Hello. Today we're returning to the subject of neurodiversity in criminal justice, which we discussed over a year ago. With me are two experts on brain injury and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. David Breakspear is a former prisoner and ambassador for ADHD Liberty. Stan Gilmour is now a professor, but spent most of his career in the police service. Rob, there was a public spat recently between the Lord Chancellor and the Sentencing Council, which is responsible for sentencing guidelines, as to whether certain kinds of defendants should be sentenced differently to others. Did neurodiversity feature in that spat?
Well, not so much in the spat, but what this is all about is the Sentencing Council including a list of types of defendant where courts should normally ask the probation service to provide a pre-sentence report, providing extra details about personality, circumstances and so on. Then it included people with neurodiversity. The Lord Chancellor took exception to this for some reason, thinking that this amounted to some sort of two-tier justice, treating certain people in a different way. I mean, to my mind, it's sensible for courts to get as much information as possible.
What about you, Stan? Did you follow that spat and what did you make of it?
There's already guidance around neurodiverse defendants. It's hidden under mental health, which is problematic, as we know. But the issue is that you need to know as much about the circumstances of the person as possible before you sentence. So anything that delivers that's got to be good. And it's not as if it's a new idea. There's a great letter on the wall at the police college in Tullyallen where the chief constable of Stirling Police asked for background checks to be done on young people that came in front of the courts over 100 years ago. So the idea that sentencers should know about the people that are in front of them is sensible. And the whole idea of a two-tier system is just ridiculous.
David, looking at ADHD, you have ADHD yourself. What age were you diagnosed with it?
I wasn't diagnosed until I was 40, and that was after becoming entrenched in the criminal justice system.
When did you start in the criminal justice system?
When I was 10.
10, wow. Why did it take so long for your ADHD to be recognised?
Obviously, I'm going back to the early 1980s, so it was a lot easier then to label someone as challenging and disruptive, as a troublemaker, so on and so forth. And then I suppose the system becomes bored of you. Oh, you again. And don't look at the reasons why you've come back again. So you kind of just keep slipping through the nets, really.
Stan, does the similar sort of thing happen with brain injuries? A lot of people who end up in the criminal justice system have these, but are they diagnosed early, ever?
You're rarely diagnosed. And it starts when you're very young. You get labelled as being disruptive and you go on a pathway then and what's called the school to prison pipeline.
Just focusing for a minute on the people with brain injuries, do you think they are more likely to get into trouble than people without? It might seem a fairly obvious question.
I guess the first thing to say is there's nothing deterministic about what happens. You're not set on a course. Nobody is. But the research would show that there's a higher likelihood that following a brain injury, you will get into trouble with the police. And, you're 5 times more likely to collect a brain injury under 5 years of age if you're in the poorest 5% of the population. So it's not evenly distributed. And all the other social determinants, as it's called, all the other things that happen in your life, in your family's life, in your school life, in your work life, are much more likely to lead to poor outcomes if you're within that kind of poorer group with a disability or a neurodiverse condition.
And how do people sustain these brain injuries?
Well, most of these brain injuries are caused by falls or road traffic accidents. But when you look at specific populations, for example, women in prison, 2/3 of the women with brain injuries receive their brain injury from a male partner. It varies by population.
And for men, does some of that brain injury come from fights?
Fighting other men,
Right.
including in prison. Following a brain injury, you're much more likely to be involved in a violent offence or a violent event, and being placed in an environment where violence is much more likely doesn't seem to me to be a wise move for prevention.
Getting back to the kind of behaviour issue,
Yeah.
there are a higher proportion of people with brain injury who get into trouble with the law. What does the brain injury lead to in terms of behaviour which gets people into trouble?
So one of them would be the idea of being impulsive, an inability to forecast the consequences of your actions. Other things would be controlling your emotions and your temper, being what would be regarded as socially inappropriate.
Like?
Anything that would put somebody's back up, really, or an observation, speaking out of turn, not really understanding that, saying somebody looks nice, for example, is, socially acceptable, but not in some circumstances. And it's the ability to navigate and negotiate those kind of social niceties that can put you on the wrong side of a quarrel. And then, your impulsivity, your lack of control could then kick in. And those are the kind of things that multiply and can easily put you in a situation where you're involved in a violent event.
David, when you look back on your life and your involvement of getting into trouble over many years and in different ways, how do you link that with your own experience of what you now know to be ADHD?
Well, it wasn't just my ADHD. I mean, I went through a period of sexual abuse when I was 8 years old, and then at the age of 10 I contracted meningitis. So basically, I was odds on that I was going to end up in the criminal justice system. But I was only odds on. You talk about brain injury, we talk about ADHD, dyslexia, whatever. It's the lack of support and intervention alongside, if you like, their poor behaviour. And what Stan was mentioning there, I think a good example is if the video last year that went viral of a young girl who told a female officer she looked like a lesbian, and the female officer didn't handle it in the best way.
She told a police officer that she looked like a lesbian.
Yeah, it went viral. I believe the officer was disciplined over it, and turned out the girl was autistic.
Sorry, why was the officer disciplined?
Because of the way that the child was handled. It went from 0 to 100 in seconds, and obviously that was why the video probably went viral as well. But it goes to show that the lack of understanding, what you see in front of you is what's being exhibited. It might not be the person that's behind it.
I mean, is that true for you in your experience?
I think so. I mean, I'm not saying that I was an angel, but if authority had handled me, approached me, spoke to me in a different way through their understanding, which they didn't have back then in neurodiversity, I'd probably have less offences for assault, police or resisting arrest.
And it's interesting because we've all watched this recent Netflix series, Adolescence, where there's a boy who's accused of murder who's got an incredibly short fuse, hasn't he?
This is part of the issue is, that people are bubbling close to the surface. And you can see he looks very calm.
This is in a room in prison, isn't it? Yeah.
So he looks very calm, and then all of a sudden he's not. And that's very typical.
And scary as a child going through it because you don't understand why. You can't stop it. It just happens. It's one of those things that you kind of act now, regret later. You can't control it. You've got the police in front of you. Of course you should be calm and collected and so on, but you don't. You just lose it. Looking back, it's so cringy and embarrassing, but then obviously I didn't understand myself and I didn't know why we'd done those types of things.
And what about the people, adults that you were dealing with? I mean, not just the police, teachers, social workers. Did anybody show any sort of sympathy or understanding, or was it?
You got sympathy, but it wasn't sympathy you wanted, really. It was action. You didn't want people, I'm so sorry, come and sit down here and have a glass of water. People never really asked you what's going on. I suppose because of your behaviour went first, that was what they focused on. Like, you shouldn't be doing that, you shouldn't be doing this, you shouldn't be doing that. Instead of asking, what on earth happened? What's happened to you? We're too quick to label the child as challenging and disruptive rather than, oh my God, there must be something going on in their lives for them to be acting this way. Far too quick to label.
In the wrong way.
In-
Because
yeah,
if
of
you'd
course.
had the right label...
But then that's not a label, is it? It's a descriptor.
Right, okay.
ADHD is a description of
Yeah.
a part of who I am. Criminal, that's a label.
Going back, though, to your childhood and this getting into trouble with the law, what kind of crimes did you do that actually got you into real trouble?
Antisocial stuff, really. So graffiti, we'd go into the park and we'd have mud fights across walkways and things.
And you got into trouble with the police for that?
Well, yeah, because obviously people get caught by a bit of mud or something, and the next thing you know, you've got the police being called on you.
Yeah, and in terms of getting into real trouble, like being convicted, imprisoned, what kind of crimes got you there?
The first time I was sent to custody, I took a car and I had a fight with a youth worker at a youth club. I say I had a fight, I went after him because he had pushed my girlfriend over, and I ended up getting 4 months detention centre for that.
Looking back, was that to do with that impulsivity?
Yeah, I mean, unless I was asleep, I was on the go. And even then I was probably dreaming. And even as a young kid, I'd be out from sort of dusk till dawn.
And not at school?
No, obviously that was during... But as I got older, school become more and more of a problem. Infant school, I remember being second year, I think, of infant school, and I used to have to eat my lunch in the headmistress office because of my behaviour in the school. So I was always getting into trouble at school, but nothing too serious. But then I contracted meningitis when I was 10. So that really did impact on my schooling. And then secondary school, the school I went to was when the league tables come out in 97, I believe it was. It finished top of the worst schools in the country twice. And being the youngest of six, going through primary school and junior school, I was following my siblings. So I'd always be getting, you're not like this, you're not like that, you're not like this. So I was really struggling with an identity at the same time as well. And then when I landed in secondary school, 3 of my cousins had gone there, 2 of which were like me, always playing up, getting in trouble with the police. And when I landed there, I was being told, you're just like such and such and such and such. Okay, well, that's who I need to be. And from there, really, it was detentions, suspensions, expulsions, until they finally gave up on me when I was 14, and it screwed me permanently.
I mean, Stan, is that sort of story that we've heard from David, is that similar, do you think, with many people who've got brain injuries as well?
In conflict with the law, yeah. I mean, it's not everyone, but if you have a brain injury that causes some problems with the way you behave, and the way you behave is situated within a load of other bad experiences, being a victim of crime, being abused or neglected in your childhood, then the brain injury becomes a multiplier, if you will, along with lots of other things that can come from that. Anxiety, fear, that sense of having to take care of yourself and react first, if you will. So it's rarely just one thing. It's that combination of different things that leads you into these issues that become labelled as bad behaviour when you're young and criminal behaviour when you're older.
Or even criminal behaviour when you're
And
young.
I was going to say, and the younger you are when it's labelled as criminal behaviour, the more likely it is that you will continue to be captured by the criminal justice system as you get older.
I mean, David, you eventually were diagnosed, you told us, when you were 40, I think. I mean, did something crank into action then? You got a lot of support and help? And...
No. To be honest, Rob, when I received the diagnosis, I wasn't in the right frame of mind. I wasn't in the right place mentally, physically, environment. It just become another label, I suppose.
So nobody really offered you any...
No, I was in prison. It was done for reports.
You mean reports about you? Did staff treat you any differently once this label had been
No, because
given?
your medical health is confidential from prison staff.
So the prison officers didn't necessarily
The prison
know.
officers wouldn't know. Most of the healthcare wouldn't know. And let's be honest, information sharing in prison or even in the criminal justice system isn't the best in the world. I had conversations with prison officers, some of whom would say they're just excuses.
Still?
I'm going back then, but I would say that, yes, probably even now, you've got people that will say that neurodiversity, brain injury or anything like that are excuses for people. And again, it comes back to the support and intervention you get. Diagnosis is great, but it's like being given the winning lottery numbers and not putting a bet on.
Stan, we've kind of discussed how behaviour related to brain injury might lead to arrest. If we're thinking about police custody or even court, how do people with brain injury cope with the kind of questioning you get in those situations, say in police custody?
It varies, obviously, by condition and type, but some of the kind of obvious things, I guess, are if you're asked those linear questions, tell me what happened then and what happened next. Some of that's quite difficult to follow. By the time they ask you the third part of the question, you've forgotten what the first part was and why it's even relevant. One of the issues with questioning people is that the questioner is trying to find the truth. So they're making a judgment on what's being said, and you're being judged on whether you're telling the truth or not. Well, what cues do they use to say, well, I think they're telling the truth, or I think they're lying? Humans are very bad at telling whether somebody's lying or not. It's a 50-50 game. And they use the cues to say, well, they were vague. They didn't say important things when, they should have done. When that was pointed out to them, they became angry. They were evasive. All those things that are very typical, both of the general trauma of being arrested or having, been involved in something, but also very common when people have neurodiverse or neurodisabling conditions. So there's an institutionalized bias that puts people with these conditions in the wrong place when it comes to being believed, and also in the wrong place when it comes to understanding their rights or what they're even being asked.
So it's a kind of game which people who are not neurodiverse are just better at playing in terms of answering the questions in the way
following along, being able to articulate, why these things happened and the sequence of events that led to them. And the way, generally speaking, that people check if you understand is by saying, do you understand? And of course, everyone's programmed to say, yes, I do. There's a huge amount of shame within the system as well that causes a lot of masking, a lot of, pretending that you understand. Yeah. So, the system's really gamed against you from the start.
And there's fear as well, Stan. You're worried that if you tell people the truth about what's happened, they're going to, section you or hold it against you.
Yeah, and it's all parts of the system, not just the criminal justice system, but the education and health, etc. You're trying to navigate them whilst you're loaded up with this fear and misunderstanding about what's going on. So it's gamed against you. And what we haven't touched on is the kind of high prevalence of these conditions as a result within the criminal justice system. Huge overrepresentation of people with these conditions. And my question would be, why is that the case? And what is it about the systems that lead people there that maybe causes that or maybe doesn't prevent it?
Talk about asking why. Do you remember how you coped with being interrogated, whether in police custody or at court?
Police custody, not too bad, because as I got older, I got more experience at it. I wouldn't ask for a solicitor, but I would ask for a phone call, quick chat with a solicitor, come back, taking advice from my solicitor, and I'll be given no comment statement. So that was quite easy to do. In court, you can't do that. And I'd got a couple of charges on my criminal record for contempt of court because of my behaviour in court.
What did you do?
Well, I argued with magistrates. I had no respect for magistrates at that time, so I'd turn up, but I wouldn't respect it when I was there. And 9 times out of 10, I'd be sent up the road to Crown Court, where again, I would be aggressive towards judges. Rather than ask questions, I'd argue and I'd debate. I'd ask, should you be asking me that question? How would you feel if someone asked you? So I'd always turn it back on them, do you know what I mean? And having said that, whenever I was arrested, charged, then convicted, I'd always done something wrong. So I had nothing to lose, if you like, whenever I go to court. That's the way I felt. It's funny kind of looking back, but it's also embarrassing. But then again, it's like I couldn't stop it.
Really interesting to hear that you had nothing to lose, because of course you did. Being fast-tracked from magistrates into the more serious heavier sentencing regime of the Crown Court just draws you deeper into the criminal justice system. And this is something that we see happening a lot with people who are disproportionately represented, whether it's because of their kind of race or because of a neurodisability. They get drawn deeper into the system rather than being able to kind of bargain out at an early point.
I mean, David, do you think that there's been any improvement in the court processes?
100%.
I mean, I understand your son's been involved in a case recently.
Yeah, 100%. Unfortunately, what happened to my son, it seems to have been the exception, not the rule. Cut a long story short, my son was in Crown Court on trial for 2 charges of street robbery, taking some items off of someone in the street.
Mobile phones?
Mobile phone and a set of headphones. And my son's been diagnosed with ADHD and ODD.
Oppositional
defiance disorder.
Yeah.
And my own experience would tell me that he's going to be acting in court the same way I would be. And we need to minimise that. And the court provided my son with an intermediary who discussed his ADHD and his ODD with him. That was obviously discussed with solicitor and barrister.
Could you explain what an intermediary is, David?
Yeah, an intermediary is someone that's independent. So it's not a solicitor. They're not there for the police. They're not there for the system. They're there for the individual to make sure that that person gets supported through the process in the best way possible.
And understands what's going on.
Yeah, so my son ended up in trial. We was at the Royal Courts of Justice. The prosecutor and the barrister had the conversation together and also with the judge. But it was as if it was a discussion that happens every day in court. It wasn't as if like, oh, I need to speak about something special. It was like they spoke about it in a way that made me think this is the rule, not the exception. And then before the trial began, the jury come in and the judge explicitly explained to the jury about the issues that my son may face or the inappropriate behaviour. He could laugh in the wrong place. He might make noises when someone speaks. Honestly, it was fantastic to see. My son ended up getting 2 not guilties. The evidence was a bit shaky anyway. To be honest, we don't know how it made it to court. But I still wonder, had that not been the case with the judge explaining it to the jury before it began, whether or not they may have thought perhaps there is some guilt there. And the judge also allowed him to get up and walk around the dock for 5 minutes while the jury were there. And for someone like myself, and I've worked with Birkbeck University on a training video for judges talking about neurodiversity in the criminal justice system and how we can come across. And then to see it actually in action, 18 months later was an incredible thing to see. But again, I keep coming back to the fact that my son's case was the exception and not the rule. It doesn't appear to be happening in every court up and down the country.
But at least, I mean, that's a relatively encouraging move, isn't it? That at least it...
Massively so.
Yeah.
Massively so.
I mean, Stan, does that ring any bells for you? Do you think there have been some greater recognition, either in the courts or even in the police station?
There definitely has, but it's not embedded at the heart of the system. As you know, has been said, it's not the rule. The research is there, the procedures are available, they're just not routine. And that would be something that I would love to see, is that they're being made routine, but they have to be flagged early enough for them to happen. And it's rare that somebody gets their needs acknowledged and accommodated early enough to make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, going back to police custody, I've kind of been in meetings where there's a lot of talk about painting walls pastel colours and, you know, giving people fidget toys. But those are kind of quite small things, aren't they?
They are small things, but they do make a big difference.
And it's happening.
And it is happening. So the issue is, you know, do we continue to optimise the system or do we think of a new way of doing things? But those accommodations should be routine. Experience that people have in police custody should be based on what the police would call achieving best evidence. So if you want to achieve the best evidence, which is a core policing purpose, then you do that by understanding the specific needs of the people that you're dealing with and being able to tune towards those needs. So it's not a case of being soft on people, it's a case of getting the most accurate information, which is difficult when somebody doesn't understand you or confused or angry or upset or traumatized by what's going on.
Talking about the system as a whole, you yourself, Stan, have said that in a sense, neurodivergence and neurodisability is itself criminalised, that there's behaviour that is labelled as criminal, which is simply the type of behaviour that is normal to people with those conditions. Can you explain that a bit?
So the criminal justice system is looking at behaviour to say, well, is this behaviour criminal behaviour? Has there been some malice in this, or is this just the way that somebody is behaving? And often it judges that on the outcome, not on the individual circumstances. And if you understand that people behave in non-typical ways for reasons other than they are a criminal, then it allows you to perhaps design systems that take that into account and try and prevent those behaviours from becoming criminalised. So there will be some things that may be inappropriate, touching, the way you might speak to somebody, a fixation perhaps that you might have that somebody feels uncomfortable about, and probably rightly so. But those things need to be understood in ways that are not just about it's criminal, in ways that are about why are they behaving this way and what can we do about it, and seek to do that earlier than you might want to through a criminal justice intervention.
So somebody who's neurodiverse sending a series of unsolicited text messages to someone else, say a man to a woman, that may not be because they're deeply misogynistic, but because they've misunderstood the relationship they have with the person.
It could be. The impact is the same on the person, perhaps, who's receiving them, and they feel that they're being stalked or they're being threatened. So there does need to be an intervention. You can't just let it happen. But I think that intervention could be a bit more thoughtful, perhaps, than the kind of hard, sharp edge of the criminal law.
But then once you become known to the police, from my own experience, walking home from a nightclub 2:30 in the morning, slightly drunk, pull you over. What are you up to? Where are you going? Straight away, that you're guilty in their eyes because of what you've already been up to before. And then the next thing you know, the situation has escalated into the point where I ended up in the back of the police car, arrested for a common assault, resisting arrest, whatever, all because I was literally just minding my own business, walking home from a nightclub. Now, I'm not saying I don't understand why they would pull me over, because the chances are I would have been up to something. But at that particular time, I wasn't. If I feel hard done by, I react in the wrong way. I love my justice sensitivity now because of the work I do, but from back then, it obviously caused me a lot more trouble than it did good.
I mean, Stan, I don't know what you think about this. When people with ADHD or brain injuries do get arrested, prosecuted, convicted, sentenced, do you think efforts to rehabilitate them are very much more difficult, or are they just different?
Rehabilitation. I'm not certain that there's a lot of rehabilitation goes on within the criminal justice system, full stop. But when you look at the high numbers of people in prison, for example, with brain injuries, it's 60, 70, 80, 90%, depending on the research that you look at. So high numbers in prisons. And my colleague, Professor Hugh Williams, would always say prisons are brain injury clinics without the resources to rehabilitate. So I think there's more opportunity to be rehabilitative, but you have to understand what it is you're trying to rehabilitate. And just concentrating on behaviour is missing the trick to say, well, actually, if we want to pull some levers to improve somebody's behaviour, then maybe we need to treat their brain injury, for example, because there are treatments and there are recovery patterns. Once they start recovering from that, we can then look at other things that we need to do.
Well, thanks. Perhaps that's a point at which we need to end what's been a great discussion. We finish these episodes by asking each of our guests if they were in a position of authority, Minister of Justice, Home Secretary, what one thing would you do, in this case, to prevent the overrepresentation of neurodiverse people in criminal justice? David?
Well, for me, it's quite easy because it's something I campaign for, and that's for screening to exist in primary school from the age of 5 and then throughout the transitionary period through someone's life. Surely, the more that we understand about our young people now, the better future we can create for them.
Thank you. Stan.
So it's cyclical. This goes through families and across generations. But if you had to start somewhere, it would be in those early years to say what kind of screening, what kind of support do young people have so that they're put on a path that meets their needs. So early screening and early support for young people so that they don't get pushed down a path towards criminalisation, because the criminal justice system is not set up to deal with those kind of things. So.
Once you get in, it's very difficult to get out.
Okay. Penelope, what about you?
I mean, I suppose we can't train everybody in detail in the criminal justice system about each of these conditions, but we could get better awareness through the whole system, because awareness at least is a starting point for all these other things. And I think that there still isn't enough awareness of what the signs might be, and that would help. Rob, what about you?
Well, I was struck by David telling us that the court system had improved. I think you said not necessarily as a rule, but on occasions. And I was encouraged by that. When we last looked at this, we had Robert Buckland on, who did commission a piece of work about this, particularly in prisons, but also in the rest of the criminal justice system. That got us so far, but it's all about implementation and culture. And maybe we can't train everybody, but we do need to make an effort to get this issue onto the basic training courses for all of the professionals involved in criminal justice.
Great. Well, thanks, David, Stan and Rob. And if you'd like further information about ADHD and about brain injury, do look at our programme notes. And if you enjoy the podcast, do tell your friends about it. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.